to invite Dan to give a talk, and he's going to talk mainly about cheating for the next while.
So, dishonesty. How many people here have lied at least once since the beginning of 2012? Okay. What about the last week? I'm not going to ask you about today or the last hour. There's a very interesting but disturbing research that showed that they took two people who didn't know each other, and they put them in a room, and they said, why don't you talk to each other for 10 minutes? And people talked to each other for 10 minutes and introduced themselves to the other person. And at the end of the 10 minutes, they took them into two separate rooms, and they said, did you lie to the other person? And people said, me? Of course not. Heaven forbid. How could that be? And then they showed them the videos. And they said, let's look sentence by sentence. And people on average admitted to lying between 2 and 3 times in these 10 minutes. So the reality is that we cheat a lot. And we're going to say some bad things about cheating, but first of all, let me say something good about dishonesty. There's a story in the Bible that God comes to Sarah and said, Sarah, you're going to have a son. And Sarah said, she laughs, and she said, how can I have a son when my husband is so old? And then God goes to Abraham and says, Abraham, you're going to have a son. And Abraham says, did you tell Sarah? And God said, yes. He said, and what did Sarah say? By the way, this is my version of the Bible. It's not exactly. And Abraham said, and what did Sarah say? And God says, Sarah said, how could she have a son when she is so old? And the religious scholars have wondered, how could God lie? Sarah said, how the husband is so old, and God said, she said, she is so old. And the conclusion has been that it's okay to lie for peace at home. Right? And in reality, we all recognize that. We all recognize, I mean, how many of you would really want to marry somebody who is going to tell you the truth, the absolute truth every day? No, not such a good proposition, right? We all understand that in the social realm, some cheating is kind of okay, and we actually want some of it. It's a good social lubricant. The problem, of course, what happens when you move to the business world. And now, dishonesty is not as good, it's much more harmful, and that's the problem. By the way, I think that students face the most challenging questions in terms of dishonesty, because the overlap between your social life and your professional life are very, very overlapping. So what's acceptable in one and not in the other is very hard to find out the boundaries in your work, in universities in general. Okay. So what do we know about cheating? The standard economic theory about dishonesty is very simple. It goes back to Gary Becker, the famous Chicago economist. And the story goes that one day Gary Becker drives to a meeting in Chicago. He looks for a parking spot. He can't find a legal parking spot. And he thinks to himself, what should he do? Should he keep on looking for a parking spot but maybe be late for the meeting? Or should he park illegally, risk a ticket, but get to the meeting on time? Gary Becker weighs the cost and benefits and decides to park illegally and get to the meeting on time. And on the way to the meeting, he contemplates the fact that he just made the rational crime. Right? He thought about probability of getting a ticket and how much would the ticket be, how important is it to get to the meeting on time, and by weighing the cost and benefit, deciding the optimal strategy. And from that point on, he developed the optimal theory of crime, which basically says that we all do what Gary Becker did all the time. That every time you pass by a gas station or a grocery store, or you go to one of your friend's apartments, you think to yourself, what can I steal and get away with? What will happen if I get caught? Is it worth it? But think to yourself, have you thought about this recently? Have you thought about anything in this way? I suspect that for the vast majority of you, this is a very, very foreign thought. And it's not just foreign when we reflect on our own personal lives. Even when you look at macro data, for example, you look at the effect of the death penalty. The idea of large penalties is saying that if people do the cost-benefit analysis, as long as you have a high penalty, people will decide it's not worth it, right? So in the States, we have some states within the US have the death penalties. Other states don't have the death penalty. You would think that if people do the cost-benefit analysis, states that have the death penalty would have no crime whatsoever. Right? Who wants a death penalty? Right? That's a big punishment. You can't get bigger than that. But guess what? Every empirical analysis has failed to find any effect of the death penalty on deterring crime. So this suggests at least that we can't find evidence that people do the cost-benefit analysis. Similarly, in California, they regulated a law called 3 strikes and you're out. You can steal something 3 separate times, 3 slices of pizza, and for the 3rd one you'll go to prison for life. Again, tremendous punishment for the 3rd crime. You would say nobody would do it. Prisons are overflowing. So we don't have the macro data evidence that people are doing the cost-benefit analysis. It also doesn't seem to reflect our intuitive thought about what's going on. And I'll tell you a little bit about the experiments we're doing. It doesn't capture it there either. And then I'll propose to you an alternative theory of what actually is happening. So first of all, when we want to test dishonesty, we have to come up with a method to testing dishonesty. So we've done a few things. The main method we've been using is the following. We give people a sheet of paper with 20 simple math problems. These are math problems that everybody could solve if you had enough time. And we said, you don't have enough time, you only have 5 minutes. So if you're in the experiment, I would pass the sheet around. I would say, wait, go. You would turn the sheet over and you would work as fast as you can. When you finish the 5 minutes are over, I would say, please stop, put your pencil down, count how many questions you got correctly, and now take your sheet, go to the back of the room and shred it. And then come to the front of the room, tell me how many questions you got correctly, and I'll pay you $1 per question. We do this, people say they solve 6 problems, we pay them $6. What the people in the experiment don't know is that we played with a shredder. So the shredder only shred the sides of the page, but the main body of the page remains intact, and we can find out how many questions people really solve correctly. And what do we find? We find that people on average solve 4 problems and report to be solving 6. Now you could say, where is this increase coming from? Is it because we have some big cheaters? No, we have a ton of little cheaters. In this whole research so far, we've tested about 30,000 people. And from those 30,000 people, we found a handful of big cheaters, and all the big cheaters together stole about $150 from me. We also found about 18,000 little cheaters, and together they stole about $36,000 from me. And I think this is probably kind of a good way to think about the economy. Sure, there are some big cheaters out there, and it's really sad when it happens, but there are so few that the economic impact is not that high. On the other hand, we have a ton of little cheaters, and because everybody can do it frequently, the economic impact of that is much, much higher. So now we have a method to estimate dishonesty. How do we figure out the Becker model? The Becker model has 3 elements. Probability of being caught, time in prison, and how much do you stand to gain. We played with those. We changed the probability of being caught, we changed how much people stand to gain. We found no sensitivity. You increase how much people stand to gain from cheating, cheating stays at the same level. You decrease the probability of being caught, people cheat at the same level. So it's not as if people are angels, that nobody cheats. No, people cheat. They just cheat in a way that is not sensitive to the economic incentives. So what's going on? We thought that maybe what's going on is that people are trying to kind of balance economics and psychology. On one hand, we want to look at the mirror and feel that we're good, honest, wonderful people. Think of this as ego utility, right? You want to think of yourself as a good person. On the other hand, you want to benefit from cheating. Now, I'm not talking about kind of calculation, long-term benefit, and so on. Selfishly, you want now to benefit from dishonesty. It's kind of a short-term, selfish motivation to benefit from dishonesty. And now you could say you can't do both. You're either honest or you cheat. Well, it turns out you can do both. As long as you can rationalize it. Thanks to our flexible cognitive psychology, as long as we cheat just a little bit, we can cheat a little bit and still think of ourselves as good people. And if you think about it, what it means is that the essence of the whole thing is the ability to rationalize. that when you can rationalize something, you can cheat more and still feel of yourself as a good person. When you can't rationalize, it's harder. So let's think together about rationalization. Imagine that rationalization was like a machine, that you can make it bigger or you can make it smaller. Every time it would become bigger, people would cheat more. Every time it would become smaller, people would cheat less. So let me ask you, what kind of things do you think would change people's ability to rationalize? What kind of things would change people's ability to rationalize? Sorry? Their intelligence. Okay. So you can say, do intelligent people rationalize to a higher degree? We actually tested intelligence and we found that the answer is no. What other personality traits do you think would get people to cheat to a higher degree?
Who they perceive they're hurting?
So that's not personality. Let's talk about personality for a second. What personality traits, like intelligence, would get people to cheat more? Impulsivity. I think that's highly possible. We've tested it with the prison population. We found no evidence for that. But I think it's interesting to test it beyond that population. What else?
Optimism.
Sorry? Optimism. Interesting. Possible. We didn't test this.
Ambition.
Ambition could be a drive. Greed. Possible.
Cunning.
Guilt. Cunning. I'm not sure. Cunning is not a real personality trait. I'm not sure what exactly it is. Like ability. What else?
Extroversion.
Extroversion, competition, lots of interesting things. We only tested 2. I'm looking for ideas, really. So we tested intelligence. We found no evidence for that. And the second thing we tested was creativity. Creative people cheat more. Now why? Think about it. Think of yourself as a good person, cheat a little bit. It's all about telling a story, right? If you are more creative, you can tell a better story. And therefore you can cheat more and still think of yourself as a good person. We tested this, by the way, both with undergraduate students. We also tested it by using manipulations that are called priming, in which you can actually get people to be slightly more creative for a short time. And we found that as we get people to be slightly more creative, we got them to cheat a bit more. We also went to a big advertising agency. And we tested the moral flexibility of people in this organization. And we found that as the jobs increased in creativity, cheating went up. Maybe it's good news, right? The accountants were the most honest. But it does say that creativity does increase. Now, it's not, by the way, the case that creative people cheat and non-creative people don't cheat. It just tells you it's the ability to tell stories, and as your ability increases, cheating increases as well. Okay, so this is personality. What else? What did you say?
I said their perception of who the cheater
The perception of who you're hurting. So we did the following experiment. We went to coffee shops in Boston, and we came to people, a research assistant came to people and said, would you mind doing an experiment for 5 minutes for $5? Almost everybody said yes. He gave him the experiment, describe how to do the experiment. 5 minutes later he came, I said, here's your $5. Please count it and sign a receipt and leave the receipt on the table. But he actually gave them $9. And the question is, how many people in Boston would give the money back? So slightly more than 50%. Right? You can decide for yourself if it's a high number or a low number. In the second condition, when he explained the experiment, he pretended somebody called him on his cell phone. He was trying to explain, he started to explain the experiment, how to do it. He picked up his phone and he talked to John for 12 seconds about pizza. Put the phone down, went back to explain the study. What happened now? Now just slightly more than 10% of the people gave the money back. What happened? The moment he offended them, right, people were able to rationalize it. You hurt me, now I'm actually restoring karma to the world by doing this. By the way, what was really sad was that sometimes he presented the experiment as his experiment and his money, in which case if you didn't return him, you would hurt him back. And sometimes he said it was an experiment for somebody else, and somebody else's money. He was just working there by the hour. Do you think people cared? No. They got offended, they could rationalize, they didn't return the money. It really didn't matter who they were hurting. It was just about rationalizing. What else? What else would change rationalization? Psychopathology. Psychopathology, that's kind of extreme, right? So the things I'm telling you now are really not about psychopaths. I mean, if you think about psychopaths, psychopaths are kind of the real economic people, right? These are people who have no morals. It's just about cost-benefit. I will tell you one story that started like a story with psychopaths. So in addition to doing lab research on cheating, I also talk to big cheaters. I invite people who've cheated in all kinds of ways to come and talk to me and tell me their stories. And these are fascinating stories. One of them, this was a guy called Sam Antar. And when Sam was 12 years old, he was brought to work for the family business. And the family business was an electronic business. They were selling TVs and VCRs and stuff like that. And they were teaching him the 3 rules of retail. And the 3 rules of retail were the following. The first thing was that they would use bait and switch. They would put ads for very cheap merchandise. People would come in, but as they will come in, they would try to convert them to buy more expensive stuff that had higher margins for them. The second rule of retail was that the government was not entitled to their money. It was their money and they were trying to avoid taxes as much as possible. So nothing in cash, not depositing things in the bank, not taking credit cards and so on. And then the third rule of retail was that every winter they would take all their merchandise, they would put in a corner of the room, they would pretend that the pipes above it broke, and they would submit an insurance claim. And sometimes the insurance claim would pay them and let them for a small fee keep the spoiled merchandise, in which case they would switch insurance company and wet the same stuff next year. Anyway, Sam is 12 years old, he learns these 3 rules of retail and he grows in the company. It's the company of his cousin, Eddie. The company, by the way, in the US was called Crazy Eddie's. That was this, and they had these commercials in which Crazy Eddie would come on TV and talk about how great their prices are. Anyway, when Sam becomes 18, he goes to college. And what do you think he goes to study? Accounting. Where have you been for the last few years? He goes to study accounting. So he studies accounting, and 2 years into accounting school, he comes to the family, it's a family business, he sits them all on the table, and he says, we have been doing things the wrong way. This is not right. What we have been doing is skimming. We've been taking an amount of money and not paying taxes. This is skimming. This is not right. If we really want to get wealthy, we need to become a public company. We need to have an IPO. Then we can dump stocks and really get wealthy. Now, to dump stocks and to have an IPO, you need to show an increase in revenues. Because if you show an increase in revenue, you would get a good multiplier on your IPO on the day. Now, every company that wants to show increase in revenue have to work harder. The Antar family has another possibility, which is what? They can cheat a little less. So for the next 4 years, they cheat by 25% less every year. And they show this dramatic increase in revenues. And they have a very successful IPO, and over the next year they dump $100 million worth of stocks. Now, up to the discussion with Eddie, with Sam, up to this point, he seems like a perfectly rational person. He seems like a poster boy for the Chicago School of Economics. Right? The guy just cares about money, nothing else. Auditors, customers, insurance, nothing else matters. But here is the other side of the story. And this is the question of how the family fell from grace. Eventually they all ended up in prison. And the story is that Eddie's father used to be the head of the hierarchy. He used to be kind of the patriarch of the family. People used to come to him for advice. He would hold court. He would give them suggestions. But all of a sudden, his son, Eddie, gets $100 million worth of stock, becomes really wealthy, and guess what? People start going for advice to Eddie. And then Eddie's father is not too happy with this new situation. He tries to get power back, but he can't. And he tries to get power back and he can't. So, Eddie has a wife called Debbie, and behind her back everybody calls her Debbie 1. And Eddie also has a mistress, also called Debbie, and everybody calls her Debbie 2. And one New Year Eve, crazy Eddie's father calls Debbie 1 and gives her the address for Debbie 2's apartment. And Sam said it in the family, they call this the New Year Massacre. And no blood was shed, but it was a very unpleasant evening. Now, up to now, we talked about fraud of the government, insurance, customer, everything, and Sam is stoic. This is the first part in the discussion that he is morally outraged. And he looks at me and he says, there are some things you just don't do. There are some lines you don't cross. You don't tell a wife about her husband's mistress. Like, this is a violation, right? This is just something you don't do. And by the way, he was not the only one who thought this way. Everybody in the family was outraged. And eventually this broke the family. It broke it into two branches, the people who believed in this moral violation and not. And eventually they gave information to the FBI to turn their own family in over this violation. Now, here is the thing. The first hour and a half I talked to Sam, he sounded like a psychopath. Right? Just doesn't care. But then he really cares. Right? And he had this partition of morality. He didn't care anything about outside of the family, but inside of the family he had very strict morality. And I think sometimes we confuse psychopaths for people who just had a very specific deterioration of morality. So Sam was not psychopath. Because in the family, a word were a word, and a promise is a promise, and you don't tell a wife about her husband's mistress. And by the way, in some small way, I suspect you're all a little bit like Sam. Here's a way to think about this. How many of you have illegal download material on your computers? Seriously. Okay. And how many of you feel ashamed about it? Like you're really kind of consumed with guilt and shame. You think this is just wrong. We have one. I think that's exactly what's going on. Now, I don't think that all of you are bad, corrupt individuals. The fact that you are basically psychopaths when it comes to illegal downloads, right, doesn't mean that you have no morality in everything else in your life. I think you've taken that particular domain and said, this is not a moral domain. This domain that there's nothing about morality, this is a domain that is perfectly okay to download illegal stuff. I don't feel bad about it at all. And I think this is actually incredibly common. That we take domain by domain specific and basically say, let's not worry about this in terms of moral behavior. Okay, what else would change people's ability to rationalize?
Emotional state.
Sorry?
Emotional state of the time.
Emotional state. So what do you mean?
So if you're feeling, I suppose, more emotionally unstable, it's harder to rationalize things objectively.
Okay, so there's lots of things that can go under emotional states, right? You could see, what about being drunk,
Yeah.
for example? So we find that when people are drunk, they become much more selfish. Care less about the other. You could imagine all kinds of things. I'm sure you have experience with that. What else? Yeah.
What do you think that other people are doing it?
What do you think other people are doing it? Yeah, that's very, very important. So here's a study we did on this. We ran a study in the same way I've described to you before with the sheet of paper, with two changes. The first change is we gave people an envelope with all the money for the experiment as if they solved all the problems. And we said at the end of the experiment, pay us back the money you did not make. Okay? But you have all the money. The second change was that we hire an acting student. And the acting student sat in the front row, and 30 seconds into the experiment, they raised their hand and said, excuse me, I solved everything, what do I do now? Now imagine you're in this experiment. 30 seconds into the experiment, you're still working on problem 1. And this person is raising their hand saying they solved everything. No question, they lied. And the experimenter said, you solved everything, you're free to go. And you see that, I'm not pointing at you on purpose, you see that person standing up and going. What happened to the morality of everybody else in the room? Goes away, cheating goes up. Now you could have two explanations. One of them is the cost-benefit analysis, right? You could say, hey, look, in this experiment, they don't catch people. Somebody could cheat and get away with it. Nobody was catching them. The second explanation is that it's not about being caught, it's about social proof. It's about the idea that this is socially acceptable. Look, somebody did it in broad day, nobody seemed appalled, and there seem to be people like me are doing that. So to test the difference between those two, we changed the outfit of the acting student. And here's the story. We ran this experiment at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. Everybody was a Carnegie Mellon student. The acting student was a Carnegie Mellon student. In the second version of the experiment, he was wearing University of Pittsburgh sweatshirt. The competition. Do you have a competition here?
Yes, indeed.
What did you say? So what happens when somebody from a competing university steals in an outrageous, egregious way? You still get the same information that in this experiment you can cheat and get away with it. Here's a sample. But you don't get the social justification. You don't get to say, oh yeah, people like me are doing it. In fact, it's people from this other place we don't like so much, we think are not as highly moral or wonderful people. What happens now? Cheating goes down. So it's really about the social understanding of what's right and wrong. You know, there are many cases in which we know what's legal and illegal, but what's really drive our behavior is what is socially okay to do, what people around us are doing. And from that perspective, by the way, there's this tremendous deterioration because we rarely see the people who are behaving well. We often see the people who are behaving outside of the accepted envelope. One of the people I talked to is a guy who is a cyclist who's been doping, not Lance Armstrong, somebody else. and he basically said that he had to dope to keep up, right? If everybody is doping and you don't dope, you know, you're just staying away. I mean, you can't compete. So basically, he had to join the herd. And then he said doping became much more complex. It started with simple drugs, then slowly became more complex, nuanced drugs, more difficult to get, and so on. What else would change rationalization? Sorry? Wealth. So we actually tested that. We've tested people all the way. By the way, we've been setting up a little booth to test people as they get out of parole. So we're in the parole office in downtown Durham where I live. And we test the people who just got out of parole. And by the way, they cheat just like everybody else. And I think it has to do with this notion of partitioning. We're trying to get their prison records. We don't have their prison record yet. But I suspect that somebody who's a car thief could basically say, in that domain, this is just my job. But in other things, it doesn't really affect their morality. Anyway, so we tested everything, not everything, but we tested people all the way from people who just got out of prison, downtown Durham, to people in Wall Street. We don't find any difference. However, when we take people and we say, you, my friend, should have been more successful in life. You have the intelligence, the basic education, and so on. Sadly, things have just not worked out for you. Right? Like the world has not played nicely with you. Randomly, you just got punished because, you know, some random reasons. Now, if you feel that your lot in life should have been better, people cheat. So it's not about the objective level of wealth. It's about the subjective level of wealth compared to what you think you should have made. What else?
Religion.
Religion. Who said religion? Yeah. In what way?
Well, can you justify it?
Can you what?
Can you justify your act?
Can you justify?
Let's say in terms of the animosity between religion.
Yeah, so religion is very interesting. Let me tell you a few things about religion. So first of all, I'll tell you a little joke. A guy goes to the rabbi. I'm giving you the Jewish version. You can give your own version. The guy goes to the rabbi and he said, "Rabbi, you wouldn't believe what happened. Somebody stole my bicycle from synagogue." And the rabbi is appalled. "Stealing your bicycle from synagogue? This is terrible. This is awful. Here is what you do. Come to synagogue next week and sit in the front row. And as we go over the 10 Commandments, turn around and look at everybody in the eyes. And when we get to thou shalt not steal, see who can't look you in the eyes. You know, that's your thief. The guy is very excited, comes to synagogue, sits in the front row, turns around doing the 10 Commandments. At the end of the services, he goes to the rabbi and he said, Rabbi, you wouldn't believe it, it worked like a charm, like magic. The moment we got to thou shalt not commit adultery, I remembered where I left my bike. Now, where's this joke leading? We went to UCLA in California and we asked 500 students to try and recall the 10 Commandments. By the way, how many of you think you could recall all 10 Commandments? One? Maybe 1.5? Try it later, see if you can actually do it. Anyway, none of them could recall all 10 Commandments, and quite a few of them invented new interesting. It actually led us, as a side point, I'll tell you, it led us to a project in which we asked people to rewrite the 10 Commandments. We said the 10 Commandments were written a long time ago. If you were in charge, what would stay, what would go? Sadly, respect your parents is gone. But what happened after we asked people to recall the 10 Commandments? No cheating whatsoever. And it wasn't as if the people who remembered more commandments, the more religious people, didn't cheat, and the people who remembered hardly any commandments cheated a lot. Right? Nobody cheated. In fact, even when we take self-declared atheists and we ask them to swear on the Bible, they stop cheating. We just finished a study in Turkey during Ramadan. So we did a study during the month of Ramadan and the month after that to see whether people would cheat differently in those two cases. Do you think there were any differences? There were differences, but only in things that have to do with religion. So if you have things that are regulated by religion, you know, religious stuff, people are much more adherent. When you have things that are part of secular society, paying taxes, no difference whatsoever. And in our task, no difference whatsoever. So I actually think, we'll come back to religion again, but I think that religion gets its power not from the fear of God, heaven and hell, but it gets its power from regulating specific rules for daily behavior. Because all of a sudden you know where you are on a daily basis. Are you supposed to do or not do that? And creating a habit for particular activities. So, by the way, long-term thinking is just not something we do well anyway. Right? So the idea that people actually think about heaven and hell as we go through life is very unlikely. I mean, just to think about this, right? Think about long-term thinking. How many of you, just as an example, in the last week, have eaten more than you think you should? How many of you in the last month have exercised less than you think you should? Okay. How many of you have ever texted, wrote SMS while driving? This is it? Or the rest of you don't have cars? Last question. How many of you have ever had unplanned, unprotected sex?
I'm willing to admit it.
Very few. Now, if you think about all of those behaviors, these are really all behaviors about not thinking about the long-term consequences. And I think religion has this element of long-term consequences, heaven and hell and so on, but I don't think that's what's ruling behavior. I think what's ruling behavior is the specific prescriptions for what you do day in and day out. Now, the good news about the experiment with the 10 Commandments was that when you remind people about their moral fiber, even if it's not their moral fiber, people behave nicer. So we took this idea and we tried to do it in a campus atmosphere. So we tried with the honor code. Do you have an honor code here?
I don't think so.
An honor code? No. Okay. So in the US, some universities have an honor code, which basically means that if you cheat on the exam or copy or help somebody else, you would get expelled. So we got students at Yale and at MIT to sign an honor code, to sign I understand that this short study falls under the MIT or Yale honor code. Then they did a study, shred a piece of paper, no cheating whatsoever. And there was no cheating whatsoever despite the fact that neither Yale nor MIT have an honor code. So they signed it, they signed something meaningless, and nevertheless they behaved well. We repeated this experiment at Princeton. Princeton has a very, very strong honor code. They spend a whole week with the freshmen teaching them about the honor code. Discussions, debates, lectures. The a cappella group has a song on there. It's a terrible song, but it's a song. We waited 2 weeks after this crash course on morality and we tempted the students to cheat. What do you think happened? Did they cheat any differently? No, just the same. So this is kind of good news, bad news. The bad news is that 1 week-long crash course on morality doesn't seem to have any effect. At least not the Princeton one. And I think, by the way, it probably goes to much of kind of ethical training. The good news is that if you remind people about their own morality just before they're tempted to cheat, whether it has a punishment or not, eliminates much of dishonesty. So we took this idea to the American IRS. This is the tax collectors. And we said, think about what's happening in taxes. You fill the form, you fill the form, you fill the form, and then after hours you sign at the end. By that time, cheating is over. It's finished, right? I mean, people say, oh, now I sign, let me go back and fix things. You know, not going to happen. We said, why don't we ask people to sign up front? And they said, well, that's illegal. By the way, it's kind of interesting to think about it because in court, we swear first. Right? You put your hand in the Bible and you swear first, and the intuition is that that will get people to be more honest. Legal forms are all about signing at the end. Anyway, we said, what if people sign twice? In the beginning, for reminder, and at the end for verification. And the tax people said, well, that's confusing. That's particularly funny if you looked at the forms that they have. Then we said, what if the first item in the tax form asked people whether they would give $25 to a task force to fight corruption? And we said, if people answer yes to that, they would both contemplate honesty and also put some money toward it. Anyway, they were not interested in working with us. But we found a big insurance company. And this is an insurance company that does all kinds of things. And they think that they lose about $24 billion a year to exaggerated claims. And the way they think this happens is very much like our experiments. They don't think that people invent arsonies and larcenies, but they think that once something happened, they become 10% larger. So we had lots of ideas, you know, play religious music when people are on hold, change the forms, do all kinds of things. But eventually they gave us kind of a very minor form to play with. This is a form that they sent people and asked them to report what is their odometer reading in the car. And they use this to set up your car insurance premium. So if you got this number, you want it to be lower, because your insurance will be lower. So for 10,000 forms, people fill the number and sign at the bottom. 10,000 other forms, people sign first and then fill the number. What did we find? People signed first, they reported higher number, but 2,400 miles. Right? Now we don't know if it eliminated cheating, but we know the cheating was much, much lower. So this is kind of good news. By the way, this company did not adopt our procedures long-term out of the experiment. So the good news is you remind people at the moment of temptation, cheating goes down. And I want to tell you one more thing about what gets people to cheat more. So there's a little joke that Johnny comes home from school with a note from the teacher that says little Johnny stole a pencil from the kid who's sitting next to him. And Johnny's father is just furious. And he said, Johnny, I'm embarrassed and humiliated. You never, never, never steal a pencil from the kid who's sitting next to you. You're grounded for 2 weeks. And beside Johnny, you know very well that if you need a pencil, all you need is to say something. Just ask. Just mention it, and I can bring you dozens of pencils from the office. Now, why is this slightly amusing? Because I think we all recognize the fact that if we took 50 cents from a petty cash box, we would feel like thieves. If we took a pencil from the office, no problem. But actually, if we took 50 cents from petty cash box and went to buy a pencil, we would feel like thieves. So here's how we try to look at this distance question. First, we tried it with golf. Anybody here plays golf? Okay. We asked golf players, we said, imagine your ball fell on the rough. That's not a good place. And you really wished it was 4 inches to the left. Would you pick it up and move it 4 inches? And people say, I can't possibly imagine doing it. This is not what golf is about. I would never do it. Nobody I play would do it. This is just not golfing. Okay. Then we said, what about kicking it a little bit? That's no problem. I've done this before. Hitting it with the club, yeah, that's even easier. Now the outcome is the same, but you can see how psychologically one of them feels much more deliberate than the others. In another test we did on this, we did the same matrix experiment I described to you, but when people came to the experimenter, instead of looking them in the eyes and said, Mr. Experimenter, I solved X problems, give me X dollars, they looked them in the eyes and said, Mr. Experimenter, I solved X problems, give me X tokens. We paid them in pieces of plastic. They took this piece of plastic, walked 10 feet to the side and changed them for dollars. What happens when you look into somebody in the eyes and lie for tokens rather than for money? People double their cheating. Even though it became money very quickly. For me, by the way, this was the most worrisome experiment we ever conducted. Because if you think about the society, we're moving to great distances. Cash, credit cards, electronic wallet. Cash, stock, stock options, derivative. Dealing directly with people, dealing with people over great distances. Could it be that as we increase distances, people can misbehave to a larger degree, but think of themselves as good people? I think the answer is absolutely yes. So let me kind of summarize what I think we've said so far. If you think about everything I've said so far, it's really about conflicts of interest. It's about the fact that if you get paid to see reality in a different way, you will be able to do it. This is something that every sports fan knows. Every sports fan knows that if you like a particular team and the referee calls against your team, you think the referee is evil, vicious, stupid, something. Right? Now imagine you're a banker in New York City in 2005 and you could get paid $5 million as a bonus if you could only see mortgage-backed security as a good product. Now ask yourself whether under those conditions you would not be able to see them as better than they are. Now I don't mean that you would lie, that you would say, oh, I really think they're awful products, let me just say they're good. Wouldn't you actually be able to see them differently? And the answer is yes. And what if everybody around you did this? And what if there were multiple steps removed from money and difficult to compute? Now you can see, if you think about it from this perspective, Wall Street and the banking system is almost the ideal system where good people can fail. Right? We have a tendency to point fingers. We have a tendency to say, oh, this is a bad CEO, a bad leader of a bank. If we only replace them, everything would be fine. I don't think that's the answer. I think the reality is that if any of us would head Barclays Bank or whatever it is, we would have failed in similar ways. Right? The environment is as such that it taps human psychology in a way that it's very hard for people to be objective. And from that perspective, I think it's all quite sad because we really haven't learned any lessons and haven't changed much. Now, we are making some changes, but it's very slow. There are two more things I want to say. Actually, let me say, the first one is I want to say something about evolution of cheating over time. So everything I described to you so far was about one-time cheating. What happens when cheating evolves, when we give people hundreds of chances to cheat over time? What we see happening is that people cheat a little bit, right? Trying to balance, feeling good, cheating a little bit, feeling good. And then at some point, they switch and they start cheating all the time. And we call this point the what the hell effect. And the idea is that we think of ourselves in binary terms. We're either good or bad. Now, you don't have to be 100% good to think of yourself as good. Maybe 92 is okay. But if you're 68% good, that's no fun. You might as well enjoy it, right? And you go all the way. People, by the way, report this in diets, right? If you start a diet and then you have something that is not part of your diet, you say, forget about it, I'll start next Monday or tomorrow or some other time. So we thought, what would you do to stop this what the hell effect? What would you do? Why would people stop? If you think you're going to hell or you think of yourself as a bad person, why would you ever stop? So we thought about the Catholic confession. I'm guessing, anybody here Catholic? Raise your hands. Anybody grew up Catholic? More? Okay, so you know the rules. Okay, so this is no offense to the Catholics in the room. We went to talk to real Catholics. We went to Italy. We went to talk to Italian priests, and we said, look, explain to us confession. It's a really strange mechanism, right? Because if you can cheat and get absolved, wouldn't you cheat more? If your only goal is to minimize time in purgatory, wouldn't you cheat on the way to confession, just before you go? And the priest said, no, you don't understand confession. And we came up with 3 theories. One theory is the cost-benefit analysis. It's saying, you say, oh, I'm going to rob this convenience store, I have a chance of being caught, but for sure I'll have to talk to the priest. That will be really unpleasant, they'll think badly of me, I'll have to say Hail Mary a few times, not worth it, right? We tried that, we find no evidence for that theory. Another theory is like the 10 Commandments. You come out of confession and you feel pure and wonderful and you don't want to spoil that feeling, so you stay good for a few hours or maybe a few days. We find some evidence for that. But what about the what the hell effect? Right? That's the most interesting thing, that you start a new page. So we try this in the non-Catholic way. People cheat a little bit, they start cheating a lot, and then we stop them. They say, here's a piece of paper, would you like to write some things you've done bad recently? And people wrote whatever they wanted, and they shred the piece of paper. Then we give them another piece of paper and said, would you like to ask forgiveness from whatever deity you believe in? People wrote something, and they shredded it too. What happened with both of those, but not with either of them separately? Cheating goes down to the pre-what the hell level. And I think this is kind of optimistic, right? It means that religion has figured out something about opening new pages. Right? And I think we need to think about how we do it in civic society. What would it look like if we allowed our bankers and politicians to have a place to basically reset their pages? This, by the way, is also what South Africa did. Right? When South Africa moved from apartheid to the post-apartheid age, how do you move? What's the transition? They had the Reconciliation Act, in which they stood up there and said, here's the awful things we've done, and we're not going to do them again. And that, of course, does not erase apartheid, but it's a way to move forward. I think it's something interesting we need to consider about how to take more advantage of this psychology of resetting. The last thing I want to tell you is something about cultural differences. So if you've traveled in anybody here grew up in a different country than Ireland? Okay, keep your hands up. Any of you think that in your countries of origin, people cheat less than Americans? Less than Americans. Swedish? Where are you from?
France.
France? I think you're the first French that thinks that they cheat less than the Americans. Okay, so everybody who's traveled feels that the cheating is very different in different places. Shall we try different places? The first place we went to test was Israel. I grew up in Israel, so I went to test Israel. How many of you think that the Israelis cheat more in our experiments than the Americans? Raise your hand. It's a much more politically correct group than I anticipated. Anyway, I was sure that the Israelis would cheat more, but they cheat just the same. Francesca Gino, my Italian collaborator, said, come to Italy, we'll show you. The Italians cheat just the same. We tried China, we tried Turkey, we tried England. We tried Canada because the Canadians always think they're better than the Americans. They're not. And we have many more countries to look, and when we're really looking into it, and we have a big project now. But here's the thing. If you travel in other countries, you feel that cheating is different in different places. How can it be that our experiments show no difference? And I think it's because our experiments are really detached from any cultural context. They're abstract, they are general, And because of that, they test the basic human ability to rationalize. And we are not different because of culture. Now, that doesn't mean that culture doesn't matter. Culture does matter, but culture mattered in the way that I told you about Sam Anton. Culture takes particular domains of life, paying taxes. Important or not important, right? This is an answer, for example, that the Greek people have a very different response than the Germans. Culture takes something like infidelity, where the French and the Americans have, I don't know if you've seen what's happening in the US, Petraeus has an affair and all of a sudden he killed his ability to be the future president, right? Nothing illegal, just having an affair. You know, the French and the Americans have very different approach. Young people and old people have very different approach to illegal downloads. Different countries have different approaches to paying bribes to officials. So we're the same in a basic way, but culture comes and changes domain by domain specific. We did find one cultural difference. When we do these experiments, we do them in one of two ways. We either go to colleges and test students, because we think students are the same everywhere. Or we go to bars, because we think people who go to bars are the same everywhere. And when we go to bars, we also do it such that we equate the payment, so that for every 4 questions people solve correctly, they get the amount of money equivalent to 1 glass of beer in that establishment. So we use beer as our currency. So we went to a bar in Washington, D.C., where congressional staffers hang out in. And then we went to a bar in New York City, where bankers from Wall Street hang out in. And this was the only place we found the difference. So who do you think cheats more? The bankers or the politicians? Who votes for bankers? Raise your hand. Who votes for politicians? Okay. It was the bankers, 2-1. You said yes? Oh, you can't be happy with that. I mean, but there are 2 possible interpretations for this, or caveats. The first one is that the domain of cheating was money, which is closer to what bankers deal with than politicians. The second thing was that these were junior politicians. These were congressional staffers, so maybe there's room for growth over time. So that's basically what I wanted to say. I'll just end. I told you a little bit about Judaism and Catholicism. I'll tell you one last joke. A guy goes to confession. He says, "Forgive me, Father, for what I've sinned." The father said, "What have you done, my son?" He said, "I'm 72 years old, and I just had sex with 2 twins in their 20s. And the priest said, "This is terrible, this is awful. Say 700 times Ave Maria and walk around the church 16 times. And how long has it been since your last confession?" So this is my first time. Your first time? You're 72 years old, you've never been to confession? Never been to confession. How can it be? I'm Jewish. So what are you doing here and why are you telling me? I'm telling everybody.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. So just like to thank Dan for an absolutely really compelling talk today. We're really proud to have him on your patronage. I'd like to thank him for his contribution on behalf of the whole world to psychology and behavioral economics, and also for coming here today. So can we have a party round of applause for Dan, and I'll bring back.